Hi, this is Omar at Top 5 E-Bikes. In our first video of the year, we're going to talk about a brand new e-bike. That's a Ride1up Revv1. And we're going to talk about that e-bike, the specs, and then we're going to compare it to two really popular moped style e-bikes, the Super73 RX and the Ariel Rider X class. Before we get into the Ride1up Revv1, I should say that if you're interested in e-bike content or any of the videos that we've made, you should subscribe to our channel. Also like this video if you enjoy this video. All right, so let's look at the Revv1. We're gonna go straight to the website. What better source of information than Ride1up themselves? You go to the website, you go to ride1up.com, and the first thing you see is the Revv1 is featured because it's their newest bike. And let's click through and learn more about this e-bike. So a couple things. The first thing is that it's actually in pre-order, so no one should have this e-bike yet. I mean, if there are some out there, it's probably going to be demo versions, but it doesn't ship until early March at the time we're filming this, which is late January. So you got almost around 2 months for people to actually start receiving or for this bike to ship. So if you're ordering right now, it is pre-order, so you wouldn't receive it until sometime in March. The other piece is that there's two different frame types, so you can get a hardtail or you can get a full suspension. Now, depending on which option you have, there's different pricing. So the full suspension is $23.95, and if you go with the hardtail option, it's a little bit cheaper. It's $18.95, but there are some spec differences if you go with a hardtail versus the full suspension. So the main difference is that you have a smaller battery, and we'll get into this in a bit here. There are also two different color options. So you have the gray and then this moss green, almost like this military green. I think in general, just like the look of the e-bike is great. It's not, it's pretty typical of these moped style e-bikes, but this one's a little bit different because you see, for example, like under the seat, you see that there's a little bit of a design element difference, and you have the light, which looks pretty cool. So some differences from some of these other bikes, like for example, the X Class looks a lot different and the colors are different. Super 73, of course, looks a little bit different as well, but I think Ride1up did a good job in just branding this based on some of the other e-bikes that they've put out. So now let's get into the actual components. I would say the first thing is that it has a 750 watt sustained hub motor, rear hub motor, and it has 90 newton meters of torque, which we'll get into this later when we talk about the comparisons between this e-bike and the Super 73 and the X Class. But the amount of torque in this motor is actually more than the Super 73. And then when we talk about, for example, the battery size, so it's a pretty big battery size if you go with the full suspension. So if you get the full suspension, you're getting a 52 volt 20 amp hour. So that's actually the same as the X Class and bigger than the Super 73. So just remember that this has a pretty nice sized battery. Now, if you go with the hardtail, it has a little bit of a smaller battery. It's a 52 volt, 15 amp hour. So that's really the main difference between the hardtail and the full suspension when it comes to the components. It's that you get a smaller battery with this e-bike. So the battery for the full suspension is a 52 volt, 20 amp hour. So it's a pretty big battery. It's actually bigger than the Super 73. And again, we'll get to this when we start looking at the differences in the spreadsheet. And it's the same size as the Ariel Rider X Class. Now, if you go with the hardtail option, that actually has a smaller battery. So it has a 52 volt, 15 amp hour. So instead of a 20 amp hour, you get a 15 amp hour. The other difference in the hardtail versus the full suspension, aside from the suspension, is that the controller is a little bit different. So the controller for the full suspension is a 52 volt, 28 amp hour. And then if you go with the hardtail option, it's only 25 amps. So 28 amps versus 25, smaller battery. So those are the main differences. The other big thing I noticed about this e-bike when just looking at the specs are the hydraulic brakes. So hydraulic brakes seem to be the norm in this moped style. You got a big motor, you can go really fast. But the big difference I think I noticed in this one versus the Super 73 and the X Class from Ariel Rider is that it's a 4-piston hydraulic disc brake, which is higher quality, should be giving you more stopping power than just a regular hydraulic brake. So, and then you get into some of these other specs, like for example, when we talk about the tires, it's the same type of tires. So it's this 4-inch fatter tire. We can go back to the image here. You could see this. You know, to me, when I look at the specs of an e-bike, I'm looking at the motor, I'm looking at the controller, the battery, brakes. So those are the main ones. There's some other components here that we can talk about, like the fork, the suspension, what type of suspension. But we're just gonna go over high level specs here. So these are the specs of the bike. One other big one I think I should point out, and we'll get to this because I listed this one, is a weight. So the weight on the REVV1 is 93 pounds, and then we'll get to what that means compared to some of these other bikes. So here you see some additional specs and kind of what it comes with. But a pretty good offering, I would say, in the moped category of e-bikes. And we'll show you this here in a bit when we talk about price, motor, battery, and whatnot, how some of the other really popular brands compare to this to the REVV1 from Ride1up. All right, so now let's compare the REVV1 to two other popular e-bikes. I mean, the first one that popped up in my head was a Super73 RX, and I've ridden the Super73 RX. And then the other one was Ariel Rider X Class, because we've ridden Ariel Rider e-bikes. I know it's a really popular 52 volt full suspension e-bike. And it's kind of on the value side, which is really similar to Ride1up. So let's look at these side by side. I wasn't able to get all the specs, but you know, Ride1up, Ariel Rider did a really good job of publishing all these specs. Super73 not so much. So all right, so let's go through some of these specs, and here you see them side by side. You have the Ride1up Revv1 full suspension, Super73 RX, Ariel Rider X Class, 52 volt. So the first thing I'm going to start off at the top, price-wise, there's a big difference between the Revv1 full suspension and the X Class, which is around $2,400, versus the Super73 RX. So the Super73 is about $3,700 versus $2,400 for these other two. So big difference price-wise. Now, when it comes to the motor, the Revv1 has a 750 watt Bafang. Super73 has a 750 watt. The Ariel Rider X Class has 1,000 watt. So more wattage, bigger motor out of the X Class. And we know that with Ariel Rider's done that. If you think about the Kepler, so it's 1,000 watt, you know, it's high output wattage motors is what they offer in their offerings. So controller wise, I couldn't find it for the Super73 RX, at least a stock one, so I left it blank. But you could see there the controllers, 52 volt, 28 amp hour for, or 28 amp for the Revv1, and a 52 volt 33 amp for the X Class. Since we're talking about the controller and the motor, it's a good time to talk about sustained versus peak wattage out of the motor. The Ariel Rider has it's 1,000 watt nominal and it's 2,000 watt peak, versus say the Ride1up Revv1, which is a 750 watt nominal, 1,500 watt peak. And that's pretty similar to what I've read about the Super73. I've ridden it, but as far as what is published, so the Revv1 is pretty on par with the Super73. And look, I think that all three of these bikes are high power, high speed moped bikes. So it doesn't matter if you're getting 1,000 or 2,000 watt or 750 to 1,500 watt sustained, or sustained versus peak. These are all high powered motors. So I did want to point that out. Now, when it comes to the torque, there is a big difference between the X Class and the Revv1 versus the Super73. So the X Class has 110 newton meters of torque. The Revv1 has 90. The Super73 has 60. So big difference there between torque in these three. You get a lot more torque in the Revv1 and the X Class versus the Super73. The other big difference is the battery. So the Revv1 and the X Class have a bigger battery than the Super73. So you see this here. It's a 52 volt, 20 amp hour for both the Revv1 and the X Class versus the 48 volt, 20 amp hour for the Super73 RX. So you get more watt hours out of the Revv1 and the X Class. At least if, by the way, this is the Rev1, just to clarify, the Rev1 full suspension. Now, when it comes to brakes, they all have hydraulic brakes. These high-speed e-bikes should have hydraulic brakes. We talk about this all the time in some of our other videos. Like if you're spending $2,000 plus on an e-bike, you should have hydraulic brakes, especially if they have a motor that has a peak wattage of 1,500 watts. So definitely with something like the X Class, it's 1,000 watt, 2,000 watt max output wattage. So the only difference I could see about the brakes is that it's a 4-piston hydraulic brake for the Ride1up Rev1 versus others just listed as hydraulic brakes. The only difference I can tell with the hydraulic brakes is that the Rev1 comes with a 4-piston hydraulic brake, and the others are just listed as hydraulic. I've actually ridden an e-bike with a 4-piston hydraulic brake, which is the Dorado by Tektro, and those seem like they had really good stopping power. I mean, regular hydraulic brakes tend to have good stopping power. With the Rev1, we don't know what brand it is, or at least it's not listed, so I'm not sure what brand it is, but I would say those just seem to be a wash. But they do list a 4-piston hydraulic brake for the Rev1. There are some other minor differences, and one of them is the weight. So when it comes to the weight, the Rev1 is heavier at 93 pounds versus, say, the X Class, which is 66 pounds. But that also means that you get more weight that you can carry on the frame. So if you see here in our chart, on the Rev1, you can actually carry a max weight of 400 pounds. That's according to the manufacturer, and versus, say, the X Class, which is 300 pounds. There's also minor differences in the seat height. I don't know if that matters for you, but if it does, the Rev1 is 32.5 inches versus, say, something like the X Class, which is 33 inches. Now, these are just specs, high-level specs. There's obviously a lot more specs we could have thrown in here. We could have thrown in the type of suspension. We could have thrown in just some other details about the brands of the tires, for example, different heights that we could have thrown in. These are high-level ones. This is obviously just to start the conversation when you're going to start thinking about comparing e-bikes, these moped-style e-bikes. We also don't have other factors like servicing, online resources, community that's available for these brands. Obviously, Super73 has a huge community behind it, and there's a lot of information out there on how to make fixes to your bike, how to make modifications. Ride1up has a pretty big community as well. Ariel Rider, somewhat, I'm not too familiar with it, although we've owned an Ariel Rider bike. We haven't owned the X Class, so but the other piece of this about these three bikes, and I've mentioned this in this video, when it comes to the look and feel of these e-bikes, they're very, very different. So the look of these, like the X Class is very different from the Rev1. If you look at the colors, like a bright blue, a red, versus, say, these darker colors that you have in the Rev1, and even the design, the frame, and just kind of the design elements that they have, the branding is very different. Same with the Super73, so a very different look. Super73 obviously has done a really good job on the marketing side to market their e-bike, and this is their main e-bike, or the first e-bike that they actually put out. So very different e-bikes in terms of the feel and the look. But these are the specs. I think this is a good place to start when you're thinking about a moped e-bike. So here you have it. These are high-level stats, specs of these e-bikes: motor, controller, torque, battery, brakes, weight, seat height, and the max weight that you can carry on this e-bike. So I think this is a good starting point for trying to figure out if you are looking for a moped style e-bike, whether you want to go ahead and order something like the Rev1 or go with the X Class versus the Super73. And I think the Super73 is a good comparison for the Rev1 because that's a really popular moped style e-bike that people buy. And the X Class is a great comparison because I would say it's probably the apples to apples comparison for the Rev1. So I think that that's something you would have to look at. Now, personally, again, we've ridden the Super73 RX. We haven't ridden the X Class. We really trust Ride1up, so every Ride1up bike we've had has been pretty good quality, and I think for the price that you get, there's really good quality. The company continues to just put out pretty good offerings, and then also they have a more robust service and help center, I think, and just help for people that have issues with their bikes and, say, Ariel Rider. We've had an Ariel Rider e-bike. We didn't have too many issues, but it just seems a little bit slim as far as servicing versus relative to Ride1up. So I think if you're going for a value type moped style e-bike, then the Ride1up Revv1 full suspension is a really good option because it's the same price as the X Class, almost the same specs, and then you get an e-bike that comes from a more reputable company. Not to say that Ariel Rider is a bad company, but I think Ride1up is bigger and they've sold more bikes and they just have a more robust offering for it, you know, if there are issues. So I think all in all, this is a really exciting and good offering from Ride1up because now they're jumping into the moped market. And I think for them, with their value type offerings where they have really good components and motor, and then you have the service piece of it, and then now they even have a shop, by the way. So if you live in Southern California or in the San Diego area, they actually have a shop. So I think all those things combined for me made it a really cool offering. And I think if you're looking for a moped style e-bike, you should think about the Rev1 from Ride1up. So thank you for watching this video. Let us know if you have any questions or comments. Let us know what you think, whether you agree with us or not. And we look forward to publishing more videos this year.